All right, welcome back to the Security Plus preparation course. Today we're going to talk all about audits and assessments. And throughout this course, we need to figure out, hey, we're trying to prepare for the CompTIA Security Plus, so we just need to know the terminology and how do they get used in the real world. Audits and assessments are a critical process in cybersecurity. They help us identify the effectiveness of our security controls, identity vulnerabilities, ensure compliance with regulations, and even internal policies. Now, they're going to help us with our goal of improving security posture within our environments. And they do have some slightly different purposes. While audits are more formal and often compliance driven, we'll talk about assessments, on the other hand, which are a little more flexible. So, what are the differences themselves? Well, as we're working through it, again, audits are for compliance with regulation, while assessments are flexible. They normally evaluate the security controls and find our weaknesses within our organization. So, the first one that we're going to go through is our internal audit assessments. So, what we need to talk about here is internal assessments directly. What they're going to help us do is, for one, is they're going to identify vulnerabilities within our network. In other words, they're going to help us find those weak spots in the software, hardware, and network. Meanwhile, we're going to evaluate all our security controls. We're going to check whether or not all the security controls we have currently in place, like the firewalls or passwords, are working properly. Was there any missing gaps as along the way, or are they working properly? We're then going to ensure compliance just to make sure that the employees are following the company's policies and best practices. And if there are any that are not, then we're going to address these as needed. Then we're going to prepare for threats. These assessments will give us a clear picture of what needs to be improved so we can stay ahead of any emerging threats. Now, the steps of a security internal assessment are: we're going to define our scope and objectives. We need to find those areas of the organization and which technology will we assess. Once we figure that out, we will focus on network security, software vulnerabilities, and over compliance with cybersecurity policies. Having a clear scope before we go into an assessment will help us understand what we're looking for. Then we're going to gather our data. The data that we gather is going to help us determine how we're going to assess things. So we're going to look at logs. We're going to look at key staff members. We're going to use special tools to scan for vulnerabilities. This step this step is going to help us use things like vulnerability scanners to automatically detect weaknesses in our setups or even our configurations. Once we gather our information, we're going to start analyzing our findings. After we gather all the information, the assessment team will analyze the results and determine which vulnerabilities are more critical. Now, this is when we're going to start using risk management. Remember when we were doing qualitative and quantitative analysis, here we're going to use that again with the risk register to identify, hey, what should be addressed first. Once we analyze our findings, we'll create our report. This will summarize all the weaknesses that were found and some remediation steps to fix them. The report will give the organization clear action, okay? Which takes us to our final stage of where we're going to take action. We're going to take the information that was found, address it, and then make a plan of attack for all the others that need to be improved upon. Now, there are a couple different types of internal assessments. The first one would be a vulnerability assessment. This is just where we're trying to find specific weaknesses in software and hardware within our systems. This vulnerability assessment is all talking about finding those weaknesses. Risk assessment itself is a little broader, it's a little wider of a net. We're going to be looking at overall risks for the organization and how to manage them. And then finally, we could use penetration testing, where we might take a simulated attack on the system, see how well the defenses are, and help us identify how an attacker might break into the system. Now, sometimes we'll bring an external entity here. And so with an external assessment, what we want to do is to help us make sure that we're going to follow compliance normally. So whether or not we are PCI or GDPR or HIPAA, we need to make sure that these are being met. Now, this will help us bring definitely a fresh perspective. Because we work in our environment every day, we may not think outside the box or know of other attack vectors within our systems. And so a lot of times this will be an external entity where they're going to help us review things. Remember, we're going to have vendor management here, so they're going to need to be on an NDA and maybe even an MSA document before they even enter the premise. Now, what's the purpose of an external audit? Definitely what we were talking about. It's going to be compliance. It's going to be no bias. They don't work with us. They don't have to support these systems. So their opinions when it comes to our security posture is going to be no bias. And then they're going to give us some extra recommendations for improvement, which is great. Now, how does this look? Well, it looks a lot like we did before. We're going to prepare and plan. We're going to plan our scope of the scenario and make sure that we know what the scope is of the assessment itself. We're going to collect the data, and remember, this can come from so many different pieces, including logs. We're going to do an analysis and evaluation. We're going to report it, and then what's different about this one is the external entity will follow up for the remediation steps. So no longer are we trying to come up with the remediation steps. They're going to come in and let us know what they would recommend for improvements to be implemented within our organizations to stay compliant. There are a couple different externals, types of external assessments, and one of them could be all about compliance, all about those regulations, GDPR, HIPAA, PCI, whatever it may be. This will help us meet specific requirements with our industry-specific requirements. And then, or we can do just a security audit as a broader look of just how is our overall security posture within our organization and how well are we protected. And then we could go as far as penetration testing again to have them simulate cyber attacks and see how well that we hold up to external threats. This brings us to penetration testing. Penetration testing is a fancy term that Hollywood has shown everybody, and everyone wants to be a penetration testing because it is kind of cool, right? It involves simulating real-world cyber attacks environments within our organizations to identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses. Now, our goal here is just to evaluate how well our organization defenses stand up to a real attack. Now, this will help us uncover any potential gaps of that malicious hackers or threat actors can exploit. So what's the purpose? Well, just like we said, we're going to identify security weaknesses. We're going to look at those vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities could be software bugs, misconfigurations, or even weaknesses in our systems. They're going to evaluate our defense mechanisms. They're going to look at, okay, we simulated an attack. Did the IDS detect us? Or was there anything else that we need to tune in our defense mechanisms to improve their response? Then we're going to look at how we're going to see how well our security team can detect and respond to a breach. Most of the time, the security team will not know that this is occurring, and so a pen test will help us determine, do we need to improve our incident response timelines and plans? And then lastly, penetration testing also can help with compliance. Penetration testing will help us meet certain standards, again, like PCI, HIPAA, or GDPR, to find evidence that we are actively trying to protect the data. This is great for certification audits. Now, there's a whole bunch of types of pen testing. Just know that the pen testing for the SecurityPlus can be all across the board. They can be network, web, wireless, social engineering, physical. We may want to see if can they break into our facility and getting access to certain things. We might see if they can send phishing emails or get passwords from our employees. We might want to check our wireless setup and make sure that, hey, do they even need to breach the fence to get into our wireless network? And then what access could they get? We might have some public-facing web applications, or finally, we may even have issues within our network, such as VPN concentrators, that they might be able to get into. Now, we already talked about the process here. It looks exactly just like an external audit because basically it is an external audit. The only difference is here on a penetration testing is we're trying to be silent. We're trying to make sure that people don't know that we're doing this. So our planning, scoping, and reconnaissance modes is going to be how we gather all the information, but we're trying to be quiet about it. Once we gather our information, we're going to exploit identified vulnerabilities, whether or not that's social engineering or wireless or whatever it may be. We're going to make sure that we can get persistence within the network to make sure that once we're in for good and they can't kick us out. Then we're going to find a report of all of our findings, and then how would we fix this? Because remember, a penetration testing is not a black hat scenario. This is a white hat scenario. So how do we fix it from happening again? So there are two different types of reconnaissance, and you should know this for the SecurityPlus. There's passive reconnaissance and active reconnaissance. Passive reconnaissance is the way that we can gather information without interacting with our target. So we're not doing system scans, we're not doing anything there, but we may be using publicly available information like domain names, IP addresses, employee names, social media, whole bunch of information here. And this is how we're going to gather information because remember, like for instance, for social engineering, we need to build that story. The more believable the story, the better it is. Active reconnaissance, on the other hand, is directly interacting with our target. They could be like doing port scans, like using Nmap to find active services. It might be probing web applications to find weaknesses. This is stuff that might be tracked within logs if being monitored. Now, when it comes to penetration testing, we do have what we call attestation of findings. This is a formal process in penetration testing where the tester is going to document all of the things they find. This could be vulnerabilities, risks, security gaps, whatever it is, and it will be an official record of the penetration test results. This is what you're really paying for when you're getting a penetration test because this is proof for the stakeholders and regulatory bodies that we are either in compliance or things that we need to fix. In addition, of finding security gaps, attestation remains as the remediation recommendations. These actions are actionable steps that the organization should take to improve our security posture. So why is it so important? Well, it's just everything we just said. How what did they do? How did they test it? What were their findings? Did they find anything that could be exploited during the test? What are the potential risks for the issues? And so, as I said, this is going to give us actionable steps to demonstrate the accountability and compliance within the vulnerability scan and help us identify places where we can improve upon on our weaknesses. All right, that brings us to the end of this section. Quite a shorter section. If you're going to be doing this in class, this is where we'll start doing our Kahoots and testing of our knowledge. I'll see you next time for the next section. Keep studying for that SecurityPlus. It is right around the bend.